First thing I want to say up front is a disclaimer. I do not claim to be the authority on all things vet that are happening right now. Because for those of you who are sure you're aware, it's a very quick moving feast at the moment. The sands are literally changing underneath our feet. So I do this workshop for the department regularly, and every time I come to do this workshop, they give me an extra day of preparation just to update things. So it's that rapid, as I'm sure most of you are aware. I have to keep moving backwards and forwards to go through things, so forgive me if I get in the way of things. So I suppose if you've been in vet for any length of time, you must have been under a rock not to know that this is actually going on right now. So a lot of the things I'm going to refer to today will be in relation to the vet reform agenda that's currently happening. And all of the things that I refer to, you will be able to find out more information about at the Department of Industry website, which is just here. So this is the place to go at the moment for all things that are changing, for transition arrangements, for different discussion papers that are out, and for consultation phases. So the idea, I suppose, is to go through a few things, and if you're anything like me, this is how I'm feeling right now about what's going on a lot in vet. There's so much going that it's an idea of just put my head down below the trenches and things will go past and I'll come up and hopefully everything will be fine at some point. Just tell me what I've got to do. And I think it's very much indicative of the climate that we're in at the moment. So we'll have a look at the current, can people see that or do they need the lights? Yeah, I'm seeing it's a bit bright, but see how you go. We're going to look at the content and structure of the national system. So that governance structure, as some of you, I'm sure you're aware, has moved and shifted a little. So we'll look at currently what we know, who's who and who's doing what at that systems level. We'll look at the good old standards, which I'm sure most people are aware are about to change as of January the 1st, 2015. So we'll have a look at what's going on around those. And of course, training packages, which if you haven't got your new package near you, there will be one coming to you soon. And there's additional changes in the pipeline for training packages as well. And then we'll finish off looking at some of the future trends and future directions of things that we know are on the horizon, if you like. And I will leave 5-10 minutes at the end for questions. So it is a bit of a Herculean thing in the sense that I'm running through rapidly. So I'm not implying that vet's a zoo, but sometimes it begins to feel a bit like that with all the things going on and all the different sort of species and agendas. But most of you will be familiar that our governance structure has changed. So this is what it used to look like, where we'd have COAG and Scotteasy and all the different committees underneath. So there's been some shifts to that in change of government from last year. So I'm just going to allude you to some of the things that you may be aware of, some of the things you may not be. So you'll see a big question mark in the middle there. So all our standing committees and advisory committees, we don't quite know what they're doing yet or where their functionalities have gone. However, we do know about some of the things that have changed. So in terms of vet and in terms of the people who make all the big decisions and the big stuff at the top, we have COAG, or the Council of Australian Governments. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, they do more things than just vet. They're responsible for health reform, they're responsible for education, responsible for a whole range of things. But in terms of vet, when we had the change of government, we saw Scotteasy disappear, and we have a new body now which replaces that, and that's the Standing Council on, and the actual body that replaces that is the Standing Council on Tertiary Education and Skills and Employment. However, I've heard recently that they've changed the name of that, I think it was in September, to the Australian, let me have a look, to the Australian Industry Skills Committee. Again, names do change frequently, but the idea of that body and what they're responsible for is it is representative of all the ministers that are responsible for training across all states and territories. So they actually come together and actually advise COAG and come together as all the different places from across the country about what's going on nationally and how they're then going to disseminate that across the states and territories. So particularly in our context for that, it's actually Kim Hames who sits on that, and he goes to these meetings and they decide all the big national agendas for vet and then how that gets rolled out between the different states and territories. So that's always been there, but we've seen a change of name, if you like, around that. Many of you will be aware, if we look on the right-hand side, that the NSSC, which has been around for a while, or the National Skills Standards Council, that's actually changed now. So we have a new body that represents, if you like, the administrative, the governance side of training packages and quality. So they're the advisory body for that. And we have the Industry and Skills Council Advisory Committee, and they've replaced the NSSC. Below that, we've seen the Department of Industry take carriage of a number of different things. So the Australian Qualifications Framework Council, most of you will be aware that the... Sorry, will we have a copy of the slide pack? I'm not sure if that's made available.
You get access to what you're saying now.
Yep, you will. So that replaces, I suppose, that work that's been done on the implementation of the new AQF. We've seen that being taken carriage of the Department of Industry. We've also seen the Department of Industry replace the National Vet Equity Advisory Council, so that council that was responsible for making sure that we have, access and equity, equal participation, advisory for people from, I suppose, marginalised groups and access to training. We've seen that being replaced by the Department of Industry. And along the bottom, the Department of Industry have also taken up the role of NATESI. They were the National Advisory for Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment. And what they did was they provide secretariat services, if you like, up through into the national body. That's been replaced by the Department of Industry. And what's happened is we've seen a lot of those functionalities go to the Department of Industry, which I think is a good thing. Instead of having all these different bodies and councils all over the place doing different things, one of the things in the reform agenda is to try and simplify VET, to bring things together, to have sort of one sort of area dealing with all things VET, rather than this fractured thing that we've had for a couple of years now. So a lot of those things you'll actually find have gone to the Department of Industry, and when you go to their website, you can access those and look at those and see what they're currently doing. Things that haven't changed, things down there in red at the bottom, are good old ASQA, or the Australian Skills Quality Authority, and TEXA, or the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Agency. So those national regulatory bodies, they will remain the same. And you might not be able to see, but there's two little red boxes to the left-hand side, which is the Training Accreditation Council, or our TAC, and the Victorian Registration Quality Authority, or the VRQA. Now, in those two states, as I'm sure you're aware, we have dual recognition currently, or dual regulation, if you like. So some RTOs will be with ASQA, and some RTOs will be with TAC. And they've maintained that in Victoria as well. So they also have a dual sort of regulation process where they have their own state regulator. Those things haven't changed. They've remained pretty much the same. So I suppose the big message is the stuff at the tops remain the same with a few name changes. The NSSC, again, same functionality, but has changed to a different body. But our regulatory systems remain the same. So my advice to people is, if you want to find out who's who and what's going on, it's probably best to go to, you can actually still go to those websites like the NSSC or NATESI or the old websites, and you'll just be redirected to the Department of Industry. So even if you're inadvertently looking for those things, you can find them pretty easily. So in this change or transition period, I spoke to the department and said, what's our new diagram look like? To which they replied, we don't really know yet either. We're trying to figure it all out too. And this is what they gave me. So this is the one that our department gave me and said they're currently working from, although it may have changed slightly. They've done it a bit differently, but you can see the same things exist where we've got our decision makers at the top, which is the Commonwealth and COAG and those sorts of ministers. And then underneath we have our regulators like ASQA and TAC and the VRQA. Under there, they have the quality assurer designers. So we have our industry skills councils and the advisory councils who develop the training packages and work on them. And then we have advisory functions underneath, which is state and territory officials and Commonwealth senior officials. And I think that big box with all the question marks in it is really where those advisory functions come in. So they would sort of sit in there. And then we have our policy and analysis and research. So we have the Department of Industry Secretariat, and of course we still have NCVR, or the National Centre for Vocational Education Research. So some things remain the same, something remains a bit different, But fundamentally for us in our day-to-day business, things go on very much the same. It's who does different things and who has different sort of roles and functions. But in terms of training package development, regulation, how things get filtered down, it's very much still the same for us in terms of that. But again, it's still important to know that that furniture is switching at that national level, because it does eventually filter down in terms of policy and funding decisions. So a bit different. So we'll get off and as I said, if you want to go, you can look onto the old NSSC website. Or you can look at the COAG Industry Skills Council. So they also have some communiques on there about some of those national changes that are going on in terms of governance. So either of those will give you some broad information about those things. All right. How am I going for time? Doing all right. So I always say the governance stuff, if you're still awake, you're doing okay after that, because the governance stuff I always find is the really dry stuff. So we'll look at vet standards, and I'm sure this is the bit that most people, if you're practitioners or you're working in RTO land, this will be the bit that you're quite conversant with at the moment from some of the changes that are happening. So again, most people are aware we've had dual regulation, I suppose, in WA now for a number of years. And we have a distinction between RTOs that are regulated or managed by the Training Accreditation Council and those that are managed by ASQA, or the Australian Skills Quality Authority. So in response to the, I suppose, amendments that happened, the VET Act that happened in 2011, we saw Australia move towards a national centralised regulation structure. But of course, Victoria and Western Australia refused to sign up or relinquish their powers, so we have this process of dual regulation. And how that's distinct, or how that happens, or how that's defined, is that people who offer vet qualifications to domestic students only and are only registered here in WA or in Victoria and WA, because we've bonded together now, we recognise each other against the states and territories, then you will come under TAC. If you are multi-jurisdictional, which is a posh way of saying you run RTOs in different states and territories other than Victoria and Western Australia, or if you offer ELICOS courses, so intensive language courses to students overseas or international students, then you would come under ASQA. So I'm sure most people would be aware that with that we have different sets of standards at the moment. So if you came under TAC, we would of course use the AQTF standards. So those would be the standards that we would use for regulation and we would work to and you would be audited against. And again, Training Accreditation Council, I was looking at their website yesterday, they've actually updated it a bit, it looks a bit flasher now. But again, anything to do with that is where you find with the TAC website, and it's quite good. They have an online sort of regular newsletter that comes out updating you, and if you are registered with them, they issue regular bulletins of changes and amendments that are happening to standards. For those of you who with ASQA, we have the standards for NVR RTOs, which were released in 2012. And again, those are just really an iteration or a movement of the furniture of the traditional AQTF standards. There's a few things that are different, but I tend to think of the current standards we have as just a bit of moving the furniture around, and they've sort of called them different things and given them different numbers. But the intent of the standards is very much the same. And of course, for people who are registered with them, we have ASQA. And the ASQA website is pretty comprehensive. I think there's a lot of information on there. The new standards that are coming out, there's some really nice PowerPoints and information that you can go on and have a look at, which are giving you some idea about what the changes are going to mean and what it looks like. So as we alluded, we've got new standards. These will come into effect on the 1st of January 2015. And these are not only for ASQA, people who come under ASQA, but also for people under TAC. So WA have adopted the new standards in a similar way that we have at a national level. There is a transition period for RTOs. So although the standards become into effect on the 1st of January, I think we've got until April to actually transit and meet the new standards. And again, if you're wanting to look at them, and I'm sure most people are fully aware of them now because ASQA and TAC have been doing some information sessions, you would just go and click onto that and you can download the new standards. There is a user guide to come. So with these new standards, a user guide will be developed. Some of you be familiar with the fact that the current AQTF standards have got a user guide. So that's great because you've got your 12 standards of pages of standards, but your user guide is about 100 pages. So it's got lots and lots of, taking down, saying this is the evidence that's required, this is what you might use. So I think it's a really good signal that they've decided to develop a user guide in conjunction with these standards, because with the old or the 2012 MVR standards, we didn't have that user guide. But now we've got one set of standards, hopefully, and a user guide. So hopefully, things will be a little more smooth for transition. And again, if you're wanting to look at vet standards, you can either go to the Department of Industry, or you can go back to the old National Skills Standards website, and they will actually then sort of redirect you to that. So again, doesn't really matter where you go, you can access that information and have a look at them. I feel like it is a Herculean half hour, 13, all right, I'm going. So training packages. Again, if we're not content with having to get our heads around new standards, training packages are changing, as I'm sure some of you will be aware. So our new standards for training packages have been in progressive implementation since 2012. And the idea, I suppose, is that by the end of December next year, all training packages will comply with the new standards. So they will look and feel a bit different. However, reading some of the discussion papers and issues on the Department of Industry website, given the amount of work still to do and things that are going on, it's unlikely that all packages are going to actually meet that deadline. However, some of the new packages that are out, and I was having a chat to Julie just before, who works in curriculum, is the feeling I get from people around states and territories is they're very happy with the new structure of training packages. It tends to give more prescriptive information, it's clearer, and you just have a sort of a clearer idea of how to go about doing things. And I won't go too much on this, but I call this current. I don't know whether to call it the current structure or the old structure, because it's sort of current, but we've got two current ones at the moment. So anyway, this is the old structure, where we used to have our mandated components, where we'd have our qualifications framework, we'd have our assessment guidelines, and then we'd have our competency standards. So that's really our sort of structure that's been around for a number of years that most of us are actually aware of. The new structure under the new standards looks slightly different. I won't go on to that. We'll look at this one. The new structure looks something similar to this. So we still have our endorsed or mandated components, which are our unit of competency, our assessment requirements. We still have the qualifications, if you like, or our packaging rules, and we've got our credit arrangements. Now, those things are all mandated, and that means they're signed off, and that's go forth and teach from this package. It's the same everywhere. But we also have, in addition now, companion volumes, which go alongside the package. The companion volumes are, I suppose, non-endorsed. They're quality assured, but they're non-endorsed. They're advisory only. And some industry skills councils do fantastic versions of companion volumes. Others, less so. But the idea of the companion volumes is to give you more information about how to deliver and assess and package these qualifications. So they give some very good guidelines on those things. So there will be an implementation guide, some guidance around how to develop learning strategies, assessment strategies, and some links to foundation skills and how they link to the training packages. Now again, what happens with these, the mandated stuff goes on to training.gov, our old website that's been around for ages, where we have our endorsed packages. But the companion volumes are generally found on the Industry at Skills Council website. Now, usually there's a link on the actual website on training.gov that will take you to the Skills Council website. Sometimes there isn't. And again, this is, I suppose, done differently for different packages. There's no consistency there at the moment. So it's important to know who your Industry Skills Council is. And again, some of these packages look quite different. The community services one is very comprehensive, very good. I was looking at automotive a few weeks ago. I was working with some automotive lecturers. Theirs is, shall we say, less filled out, but it's there. So we've got some changes. If you wanted, again, to look at the new standards, you can download them from the National Skills Standards Council. And again, they're still there for you to look at on that old website. But if that isn't enough, we've actually got 2 reviews going on in training packages right now in addition to what we're currently dealing with. So most people would be familiar with the fact that we're moving, or there's a shift towards moving to a more contestable model for the design of training packages. So there's a discussion paper out right now that you can download from the Department of Industry. And this is proposing a few models for how training packages will be developed in the future. So no longer will that role go to industry skills councils. There's a new contestable model looking at different ways that training packages might be developed, how industry might be involved, and how it might be funded. So if you're interested in looking, I strongly advise you to download that, have a look at the discussion paper. There's some consultation phases going on at the moment, but they're actually aiming to have this up and running, and I'll check my notes. And I think it's by June or July this year. So by July, and Julie's nodding, thank you. By the end of July this year, they want this new model running. So it's interesting to look at what they've got pipeline, how it's going to play out. We don't quite know yet. The other thing that's happening with training packages is the review of them again. So we're changing them, but there's also undergoing a review. Some of the issues that are brought up in the review have been flagged for a long time now. On the roadmap to VET and some of those issues we have with training packages about lack of consistency, lack of guidance, different interpretation, people doing them in different amount of hours. So some of those quality issues, what they're trying to do is say, how could we change training packages? Do we even need to call them training packages anymore? Should we have separate assessment centres? So there's again a whole lot of things flagged in this new discussion paper about where are training packages at? Are they currently serving the needs of our current vet system and the community in which they're situated? Can we change them? So again, I would strongly advise you to have a look at this. They're inviting, I don't know if the consultation period for this is it still going, Julie? I'll refer to Julie at the back. I think it is. Finishes soon, yeah. Okay. So there's some questions in there and you can give your feedback back. So I'd suggest that you go and have a look at these and provide some feedback. And again, we don't quite know what's going to happen. The discussion papers are out. Watch this space because things is going to change. That's all I can say. So the future ahead. I suppose, again, I'm just checking my time. I'm not being rude. Yeah, I'm doing all right. So I suppose COAG is a good place to see that. And of course, I've talked about vet reform. What's really good about this website, and I do find it useful, is that you can actually go on to reforms implemented, and it gives you a whole range under their priorities of what they've already done and what's to come. So it's a very comprehensive website in terms of seeing what's going on. When the Vet Reform Task Force was established, there were some key areas of concern. And I suppose this will be no surprise to most of us, and probably most of us living in vetland. Number 5 is probably going to be the one that stings most of us. That there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of regulatory burdens in vet, and so some of their main aims or areas that they wanted to do was to actually reduce that. And we've seen a few initiatives already come through that have begun to reduce that on RTOs. We've actually seen the fact that, you know, the complexity of the system, that diagram I put up at the beginning, they're trying to reduce that complexity of everything being all over the place. And I often think of it as going a bit like, to those of you who've been around for a while like me, it's a bit like going back to the old ANTA days where we had one body that knew everything and dealt with everything. And now we're seeing the Department of Industry pull in a lot of those functionalities. So that's sort of trying to make it less complex and come up with some consistency in application, I suppose. We've seen the standards being examined. We've seen that happen. We've seen some, again, training packages. Some of these discussion papers around packages are, again, trying to reduce that constant update burden and the constant changes that are going on. And they're supposed to streamline some of those governance arrangements. So we are actually seeing things begin to happen from this. So what's already happened? We've had some national focus groups conducted. We've seen the standards change. We've actually seen the establishment of the Industry Skills Advisory Committee, so that body to replace the National Skills Standards Council. we're actually seeing ASQA and TAC reduced some of those. We're also getting automatic updates on training packages, so when you re-register, you don't have to go through the old audit process again, excuse me. So we're seeing a few of those things change already. So we're seeing the establishment of the National Workforce Development Fund, which will come into effect next year. So that's seeing employers having access to, I think it's about $460 million for funding, but that's made available directly to employers for training. So we're seeing the redistribution of funding and that being given to industry directly. And a few things we've seen developed in terms of regulation. Again, next year, that 476 million comes in the skills fund. We're actually seeing as well, I suppose, more regular, so brain's gone dead now, seeing more of a sort of a streamlined approach in terms of the department and having a single point of entry for all things vet, which I think is a good thing, and that new contestable model for training packages. So I suppose for me, this is a bit what it feels like sometimes for those of us who work in vet. We never know what's around the next corner and we go about our business with trepidation, not knowing where the next thing to grab us is going to come from. And I think it is indicative of the system. You know, I've been around for a lot of years, but I think the rate at which things are changing right now is almost exponential. You know, so it's hard to keep a track of things. So I think it's about, you know, the change. Just be aware of what's coming along and sort of be prepared for it, but don't sort of start changing everything. Wait till it gets here, because at the moment we don't quite know what's happening and how things are going to pan out, but there are a lot of changes. All right, I made it. Any questions? Oh, thanks, Julie. She's just flashed me the 5 minutes. So any questions or any online have we got?
Not yet.
I've fallen asleep.
Sorry, where does the LLM fit with all these changes?
In terms of
The training package restructure.
the current restructure or the one to come? There is mention in the discussion papers, language literacy and numeracy is something that comes up consistently, and even in the new workforce development fund that's coming, the information to employers, they can actually access funds for language and literacy support as well at an employer level. So it goes back to the old workplace English language literacy days, I think, in terms of applying for funding. So it is something that's mentioned in all documentation. I suppose in terms of the new packages we've got at the moment, we're seeing a greater emphasis on foundation skills. So, you know, literacy, numeracy, entry into qualifications. So it features very strongly, but there's no specific funding for language literacy and numeracy that I'm aware of at this stage, unless anyone else is that's different to anything. CAVS is a state-based thing, so yeah, it's still around. I don't think CAVS is about to change. I think that's still very much here to stay from what I know from speaking to Margaret, but who knows? Yeah. Yeah.
So CAPS is quite big, but there are some other sort of programs that are available as well.
There's USIC is still around, yeah.
There's a few other courses.
Yeah.
Sorry, Becky, can you just repeat the question to people online? Just
Sure.
the answer, but I don't quite know, I can't hear you.
Sure. So the question was, where does language literacy and numeracy feature in all these changes? Is that? Yeah. Yeah. So it's definitely there. It's everywhere. But how, and again, what it looks like and how it gets funded, it's definitely a priority. Yeah. As most of us know, sitting in this room dealing with a lot of students, the reality is a lot of them are struggling with language literacy and numeracy. Yeah. Yes.
The 476 million going to industry skills funding, what's that as a percentage of, you know, money that's in take?
I have no. Do you want me?
I'm wondering how significant it is as a figure.
Yes.
And whether it's just a seed funding that will grow.
I think, do you want me to repeat the question?
Yep.
So, yeah, the question was about the Industry Skills Fund, the 476 million, in terms of, you know, what the proportion is in relation to TAFE, is that right? And is it just seed funding, or initially it's over 5 years, so that's the government commitment. It's TAFE and any RTOs cannot apply for that funding. So we cannot access it. It's only for employers. So how in terms that's comparable to what's going on in TAFE or how that impacts on the funding to public providers or even private, I'm not sure. You know, maybe someone in the department might have a better view, but it's seen as a separate body of funding, directly accessible for employers. And if you go onto the website, there's actually a 16-minute little video telling you about how the funding's going to operate and how it's going to be released. But the finer details have not yet happened. So again, it's worth having a look. It goes back to the old days when I've forgotten the name of the body of funding, but in the 90s we used to have that employers had access to funding that they could use for training. So I suppose it sees them more as purchases of trainers. So for RTOs, that would mean to be aware of it and then position yourself in the market to support industry. Yeah. Don't know if that's really answered your question, but I don't really know. 2 minutes. Any more? Yes. Yeah. No, because people are asking about when's it going to be available. It's not. Oh, someone's got one there. Is that available? I was looking everywhere for that.
Yes, I already got it. I thought
You're shaking your head.
at the first landing in the gate office.
So when did you get that at the?
There was a few weeks ago.
At the information sessions that were? It's not. I haven't seen it available on a website anywhere yet.
Download it.
Where from?
I think on the Aqua website.
Because I looked, couldn't find it, but all right. So there you go. ASQA website. Thank you for that.
Very good, actually. I have to really say it's simple and to the point.
Good. That's what we need. A bit more less ambiguity.
The website you mentioned.
It's on the
16 minutes. Where's that?
the
16-minute video.
Oh, industry skills count. That's on the Department of Industry. Yeah. But to just go back to people at home who may not have heard that, the user guide is available on the ASQA website. TAC haven't got that up yet. It says coming soon. I checked that last night. So thank you for that.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.